All right, part 3 of I'm Gone But You're Not, right? We're going to be dealing with a couple of sections here on Florida in the 1930s. We can kind of divide it up into two sort of easy chunks, right? Which is the sort of the first half of the 1930s and then the second half of the 1930s. The first part deals more with social and political issues, a little bit of economics, and then the second half deals with technical and industrial, and then also a little bit more economics. But this first section, of course, is going to be Florida in the first part of the Great Depression, and particularly the effect of the New Deal on Florida. I want to go ahead and apologize in advance for the fact that there's this alphabet soup of government programs that takes place. We're going to be talking about how all of these sort of influence life in Florida, and obviously the politics of the New Deal, which is going to be Democrat-led front and center from this. So we'll be talking about some of the main characters of sort of Florida politics in the 1930s. We get to talk about some women that make some important contributions to the political life here in Florida for the first time in the 1930s, and then also a couple of our big figures. We're going to look at one of our examples of how to be the governor, right, which is with Fred Cohn. We're also going to look at one of the great and really kind of the first big national, kind of Florida political figure with Claude Pepper. So those of you from Taylor County, hey, this is your guy, right? Florida in the Great Depression actually doesn't begin in 1929 because in a lot of ways Florida had already gotten into an economic depression in 1926 because of the crash of the South Florida land market, and then also a couple of hurricanes, fruit fly infestation. But what's going to happen is as far down the economic sewer that Florida thought it was in, when the massive national depression began in 1929, it sort of pushed it all the way down to the bottom of the sewer pipe and then flushed it all the way out to sea. Because when you compare how bad this little one-state depression was, 1926 through 1929, and then the national depression, 1929 till really World War II, is pretty stark, right? So in 3 years of the Florida Depression, right, you got 40 state banks that fail between 1926 and 1929, right? But then from 1929 through 1932, right, 113 other banks that were operating in Florida, they go out of business as well. So, wow, right? It's like almost 3 times as bad. Municipal governments, for example, a lot of the cities in Florida, particularly Miami, they began to default on their loans. What's a lot of times is unknown is a lot of governments have to borrow money on short to medium term basis in order to make payroll. Taxes don't come in every single day, and so what happens though is when you're projecting what your expenditures are going to be at the municipal level, and then all of a sudden revenue falls off, you're still left having the fact that, hey, we already spent this money, and now we owe all these people, and now our revenue is not happening. And so they're forced to lay off employees, right? So a lot of cities just, they junked, a huge chunk of their workforce. The property values that really had gone too high in 1925 and then kind of came back down to earth actually went so far down that in many cases land was undervalued in South Florida. So if you had the money, the 1930s was a pretty good time to buy South Florida land because some estimates were that South Florida land was undervalued by about 25% from what it really should have been selling at. Corporations that were operating in the state, they're losing money, and to save money, they're laying off workers. A lot of them, in fact, shut down and never reopened. The ag sector was not immune to this as well. A lot of farms went under. They were foreclosed on by banks. So not only do you have the workers that are kind of out on the street, but because many of these farmers' farms are their homes, right? It's all sort of mortgaged together, that a lot of these farmers are out of their houses as well. 2 railroads went into liquidation and receivership as well. To give you an idea of how bad this is, the railroads would continue to operate, but it would have to operate under the direction of the courts because the people that were running them couldn't figure out a way to make a profit and pay off their debts. So we talked about how important the railroads were, and if they're having it really, really bad, then it must be really awful, right? Finally, we're also going to see that the National Depression had really done a number on people's disposable incomes, right? And while this isn't the most important part of Florida's economy yet, it's getting close. And as people are unsure, even the ones that still had jobs, whether they were going to continue to have jobs, meant that people were going to stop spending money on coming to Florida. right, for their little tourist jaunts. When your question that you're asking yourself is, am I going to eat today? The answer is not, well, we need to save up money for our beach vacation in a couple of months. It's just, those two things don't really go together very good, right? And so we're going to see that the entire tourist industry, which had built up sort of huge infrastructure in the state, was kind of thrown into the lurch, where you have very few people that are coming, and a lot of jobs are sort of tossed by the wayside. So you've got people that are in Florida that are homeless, they're hungry, they're broke, they're kind of desperate, right? Now, what's interesting is coming out of the Civil War, Florida was one of the more prosperous of the southern states. But in a lot of ways, Florida faced some of the biggest challenges of the nation during the Great Depression. So here, if you give you scenes to kind of put a human face on what the Depression looked like, right? This is Deerfield, Florida. It's in South Florida. Oh, look, they're camping. It looks like fun. They're not camping. Right, that's not what's going on here. They're not camping, right? This is where they live, at least maybe temporarily, but still, kids that have to sort of survive hand to mouth, that's always a sad sort of equation. Some of these people were forced out. This is Belle Glade in southwest Florida. They're forced out of their homes. Where are you going to go? Where are you going to live? A lot of people went down to the dumps. You know, the term "down in the dumps" actually had a literal meaning, for a while, because you could find discarded items, and who's going to kick you out of living at the trash dump, right? And so you could make a house and kind of live there if you had to, right? This is life in a little bit better economic circumstances. The kid apparently can't afford shoes, but this is life in the 1930s in Florida. Something a little closer to home. Maybe you guys know some of these people, right? Live Oak in 1930, right? The streets close to home. And when you're waiting in line for a job, right? Here you can see a farmer, and he's picking up guys that he does have some jobs available, and he's got a whole truck full of people that he's already hired, and you've got a long line of others that are saying, hey man, I need some work too, right? And so this is life, right? You've got some pretty harsh realities that you've got to deal with. Every once in a while you read about these kids who quit going to school so that way they could stay at home. Mom and dad both could get jobs and earn money, and that was your job. As if you were an older kid, sometimes you could help take care of the house, right? And this is Winter Haven, down near where I grew up in Central Florida, right? Well, there is a political repercussion for this, or actually a series of them, and one of them is President Herbert Hoover, who had been kind of hailed into office in 1928, very, very successful election. All of a sudden now he is blamed. He is blamed for the economic depression and his inability to kind of solve the problem, and they're going to overwhelmingly turn away from Herbert Hoover when he's up for re-election and towards Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932. Now, Roosevelt, in campaigning, promised for a New Deal, right, for America. Specifically, when FDR looked at the economics of the nation, and this is interesting because Roosevelt was a New Yorker, he was a Northerner, but as he noticed, what was going on in the South, for the first time you had a Northern politician, after the Civil War, noticed, hey man, things kind of suck economically in the South. He went so far as to say that as bad as things were in America's northern urban cities with unemployment, he actually said that the South was economic problem number one. All right, that's interesting. So what that meant was, the way that it played out was Florida was targeted for massive amounts of federal attention under the New Deal, right? So what does it look like when a very liberal Democrat says, okay, we're going to give you guys some attention? That means we're going to throw money at you, right? That generally speaking, these big government programs involve lots and lots of expenditure from the federal government. So generally speaking, there were kind of two main modes of trying to deal with the problem. First is government regulation programs. Now, the way that this plays out in Florida is mostly trying to regulate Florida's agricultural businesses back into a healthy situation. This is largely going to fail, right? They're not going to be able to regulate themselves back into prosperity. But the second one is going to have a little bit more of a lasting impact, and that is simply just throw some cash at the problem and hope it goes away, right? So there's Roosevelt, right, giving his little speech for his inaugural. And when we think about Florida under the New Deal, lots and lots of money is going to get trucked into the state of Florida, all right? The regulatory arm of this that most heavily influenced Florida was the Agricultural Adjustment Act, okay? And it never really succeeded. It tried to regulate production and times that this amount of ag product would hit the market to try to control the prices. But there were two big work programs that did make some pretty significant changes to the state, right? The first of these was the Civilian Conservation Corps. Like I said at the beginning, I'm sorry that there are so many acronyms, but the leftists, they love acronyms, all right? The target for the CCC was 18 to 25-year-old unmarried men, and the worry about this group was not only, well, these guys need jobs, but since they are young and probably kind of hot-headed, and if they get to the point where they're desperate, these guys are much more likely to commit crimes because they don't have, much of a stronger female influence in their lives. So the CCC would they'd show up in your town with a truck or some trucks, and they would say, hey, all right, you guys are coming with us if you want to have these jobs, and they'd say, okay, and you'd hop on, and they'd hire you, and they'd take you out way in the middle of nowhere, all right? So that way, if you were going to get up to no good, you couldn't hurt anybody while you were doing it. And these CCC camps, they would put you at work doing all kinds of stuff, whether it was important or not. Public buildings and public works. For example, Fort Clinch is renovated at this point as a state park by the CCC in the 1930s. They fought fires. They built fire breaks. They cleared brush. They occasionally would build like libraries and things like that. They would fix up some of these roadside parks. But basically, the CCC succeeded in its sort of unstated goal, which is get these guys off the streets, feed them, take care of them. By 1940, when the program comes to an end, 40,000 young men from Florida had gone through the program. So this was a big deal, right? And so, hey, ladies, this is your kind of moment, right? Got pictures of a lot of shirtless, hunky young guys. So this is them working on their camps of where they're going to stay. This is them chopping down trees. This is them clearing a fire break or a logging road through the forest. This is them fighting fire, right? This is them waiting in line for chow at lunchtime. Of course, the photograph itself was taken from the top of a fire tower that these guys had helped build. The other program was the Works Progress Administration, and unlike the CCC, it had a much broader focus of who it wanted to try to employ on public works. The WPA tried to find both skilled and unskilled laborers to say, okay, you guys are a little older, and you may be a manager, or you may have a degree, or you may have something that no longer is employed, like art or music, and so we're going to try to find you guys some kind of work that will roughly approximate what you had been doing before. So these guys built libraries and courthouses. They built bridges over rivers. Sometimes these artists would be employed in public art projects. Like you can still see a few murals on the side of buildings in our area. They did ethnography projects where they recorded music and they wrote down folk stories. They did local history. They even would do technical writing in some cases for the benefit of the public. So again, another 40,000 Floridians are employed in the WPA, which starts in 1935, and they are going to get some kind of income for their families, right? So here's a little WPA banner. In this case, it's the WPA Florida Music Project, so a lot of folk music is recorded by these guys. This is a mural from the Florida Art Project down in Key West, right? Just a little bit of, this is what Key West is, right? It's an island. It's got some buildings on it, wonderful sunsets, that kind of thing. This is the Florida Folk Life collection from the WPA, where they went around and they interviewed people on what their jobs were, so that we'd have a record of kind of what people were doing in the 1930s in Florida. And when we look, though, at what was going on here in Florida as far as tourism, the first part of this is going to be a really, really bad downturn for Floridians, right? Because the Depression really kind of clobbers their disposable income, and Florida really, in a lot of ways, enters the Depression early thanks to the South Florida land boom and then bust. But while Florida would kind of enter the Depression early, in some respects, we're going to see that Florida's going to leave the Depression a little bit earlier than everyone else as well. Because by 1936, a lot of people that are still employed, they starting to figure out that, well, I'm probably going to continue to be employed, and they had put off having, Florida vacations for quite some time, and they've been saving up some money, and we're going to see that by 1936, some of the state's tourism is going to return, and kind of business starts to pick up. And by the time you get to 37 and 38, these tourist businesses noted an increase in business and have been doing pretty well. Now, part of the reason that you have this late 1930s tourism, I'll call it an upswing, right, is because there were a number of different activities that could attract different types of tourists, right? Now, for those that still had lots of money, and there were plenty of people in America that still had lots of money, South Florida was the hot spot in the 1930s that it had been in the 1920s. But what we're seeing is that road network that had been under construction in the 1930s is going to pay some nice dividends for Florida in the 1930s, because this allows an ever-increasing amount of automobile tourism to either go to the beach or to go to some camping sites in the interior near Florida's lakes and rivers, right? The elderly, with even sort of modest sums of money, begin retiring to some of these beach communities to enjoy the warm, balmy weather. And we're also seeing what is now a pretty ubiquitous sight, which is people beginning to have pull-behind campers or other type of vehicular camping kind of thing that starts filling up these public parks and these recreation areas. In the 1930s, they referred to a lot of these guys with these big sort of silver, trailers behind their vehicles as the tin can tourists, because they thought that their camper trailers look like tin cans. All right. Now, while the Depression did rage back and forth across the parts of America and really hurt a lot of people, right? There were some indigent families that tried to come to Florida and were turned away. So many of these people didn't have a specific purpose to come here. In many cases, they simply wanted to go to Florida, where, hey, if we've got to sleep outside over the winter, let's sleep somewhere where we're not going to freeze to death. But Florida police, the state police, at the direction of the governors, turned back over 50,000 people. If you didn't have a reason for coming to Florida, then they might just not let you in. And this is not exactly legal, right, to do that. But this was something that Florida did. They didn't want to have a huge number of indigent people move in and sort of continue to depress the economy, but that's what happened, right? So when we look at how this shakes out politically within Florida, the 1936 election is really, really interesting. It's an interesting sort of illumination onto how Florida politics works, all right? In the 1936 election, there are 14 people who are all candidates for governor, and all of them, of course, are Democrats, because, like I said, running for the governorship of Florida is kind of a waste of time, but as a Republican, so all these are going to be Democrats, all right? And so this election showed that while supposedly Florida had a one-party system, in fact, Florida's politics was much more broken up on a regionally based factional system. Where in Florida you came from had a much greater influence on how you got elected to a statewide office, rather than whether you were a Democrat or a Republican, okay? So we'll go through this 1936 election, and we'll talk about how this plays out, and give you a sense of what you had to do in order to win the governor's mansion in Tallahassee. What you started with, if you wanted to be the governor, for example, was you didn't start with like a statewide, let's try to get as many people to love me and know what my policy positions are and get behind me politically. You started because there was a good chance that nobody outside your local region knew who you were. These candidates would start with their local followings. So, for example, if you were an insurance company president in Tampa and you had been elected to the Florida legislature from the Tampa area, you'd start in Tampa. And you'd try to get Tampa and as many of the surrounding area people to know you and love you and vote for you in huge numbers as much as possible. All right? And so they would start with their county or local city to get the backing, their legislative districts or something like that. All right? And it was not uncommon. In fact, it was pretty common through much of this period for people to run for governor, and the person who wins the governorship after the final general election is wrapped up, that they may have been completely unknown a year and a half before. You might not have ever heard of this person. You didn't even know they were in Florida. And then all of a sudden they're running for governor. And the limiting factor on all of this was Florida's geographic sort of breakdown and the very fractious effect that this had on people and their political thinking in Florida. All right, so Florida in the 1930s, which it was more the case in the 1930s than it is today, but you can still see some of this extant in the way that people vote in Florida today. The state was in a lot of ways 5 or 6 political states. Okay, it was 5 or 6 sort of voting zones where different factors played out on what type of candidate you might want to vote for. So economic activity in your region, the ethnic makeup of your region, right, the cultural outlook of your region. You had very different sort of outlooks, and in some cases very competing political policy objectives. So we'll go through these and look and see, what was somewhat different, in some cases wildly different than each other. So you start, if we work our way, clockwise around Florida out in the Panhandle. The Panhandle was overly reliant on cotton and corn, and it had large-scale agriculture that really reminded a lot of people more of southern Alabama than Florida. And the people out in the Panhandle tended to vote more like Alabamians, at least in the type of politicians that they wanted, that supported large-scale agriculture rather than what you would see in other parts of Florida. Right now, the north-central part of the peninsula, which would be the part that we're in now, was actually a lot more like Georgia. Right, you had a different kind of breakdown in terms of the agricultural activities that people were engaged in. You also had different size type farms where you had more small to medium-sized agriculture and much more diversity. You still had cotton and you still had tobacco, but you also had beans and some cattle, some beef cattle that were being used in the area. So it was a much more diverse economic activity there. Now, the central part of the peninsula was dominated by ornamental plants, right, winter vegetable crops, and then citrus, right? South Florida, now not the coastal part of South Florida, so get the beachy part of South Florida out of your mind, was really dominated by the cattle industry, right? So the beef cattle industry, the cracker culture, that was their one sort of big focus. Citrus is also starting to break into that area a little bit more as well. But then also the urban areas of Florida, right? The cities were their own kind of zones, right? Tampa and Jacksonville are good examples of growing port facilities, growing industrial bases that had a very different outlook than really any of their even nearby agricultural and rural zones, right? And last but not least is kind of the beach areas were, in some respects, their own kind of zone, right? Where they voted very much along the lines of wanting to support tourism. And so the end result of these was it was extremely difficult to kind of fuse all these disparate results of, well, we want our state government to support large-scale cotton. No. We want our state government to support, large-scale citrus or cattle ventures. Or no. We want to be industrial. You need to have more influence on industry or tourism. And so it became really difficult, even under one-party rule, to kind of get everybody on the same page. And so, like I said, it was not uncommon to have these unknown candidates come out of nowhere and become, this guy who I'd never heard of is governor now, right? And the guy who's going to win this is a great example of kind of how to do this, and that's going to be Fred Cone, right? Now, Cone started out the 1936 election really as a nobody. He had served in the Florida House, but and he was from Columbia County. He's from Lake City, and I think he was a banker or something like that. But he starts out there, and really nobody outside of his general region knew who he was, right? Unless you had for some reason driven to Lake City and put your money in Fred Cone's bank. You're probably never going to have run into him, right? But the goal initially, right, of these candidates is not to make yourself as popular as possible across the state. It is to simply, there are a huge number of candidates, and your goal is initially, okay, I need to be one of the first or second place vote getters. Because there's nobody out of 14 people running that's going to get an outright majority, so there's going to be a runoff. So the goal is make it to the Democrat Party runoff, all right? So how do you do that? Well, you're not going to go into other people's zones where they're really popular and get them to vote for you. So you start where you're already popular. So for Fred Cone, you start in Lake City, you start in Columbia County, and you start working your way into these outlying areas as much as possible and say, hey, you guys need to vote for me, this is why you need to vote for me, and you use really sort of personal politics, okay? Once that happens, right, because the media is generally going to ignore you, right? The statewide media may or may not, cover you at this point. They probably had never heard of Fred Cone. Many of them may have needed help with a map trying to find Lake City. But once you make it to the runoff, okay, you're one of the top two vote getters, all of a sudden now you are going to get a lot of state media attention because they're going to start interviewing you. And you're going to go and do like radio, and you're going to start doing interviews for newspapers and magazines and things like that. Cone goes from the politics of sort of personal connection to the politics of charm, and everybody should love me. And this is exactly how he exhibited this ability to kind of shift gears, right? And he tries to push for, government reform and limited government. He had something really radically different to say than his opponent, and this is how he's going to get elected governor. Now, once he's governor, right, he's actually going to make a number of fundamental changes, right? He's going to vote a number of these veto a number of these spending bills, right? Because his goal was not to raise revenue to meet the budget, but to lower spending to meet the revenue. So he was a small government guy. He's also going to be the guy that starts Florida's driver's license program. Before, you just could drive. You didn't have to take a test or anything. He's also going to start this policy of the way that we collect, generally speaking, our taxes now, which is we would prefer that consumers pay the burden, which works for us because we're a high tourism state. So people come into Florida, they buy stuff. Basically, they deposit our money here, right? And rather than production. So it's goes hand in hand with what we had seen in the 1920s with the elimination of the state income tax. He's also going to be the guy that starts the Florida Highway Patrol, right? And he's going to decrease taxation on home ownership and property, right? This is Fred Cohn. He's got some big ears, right? So anyway, this is what he looked like. Probably the most dull, sort of looking guy that you could think of to be the governor of a state, right? The 1930s is the first time we're also going to see some Florida women begin to make some significant contributions to politics. Some of them are going to be by winning political office on their own, and some of them are going to be by being made high-level appointments within the state cabinet. This is actually higher nationally than in Florida, but by 1940 the state had a few women that were making some pretty important contributions in the political sphere. All right. Now, the most important of all these was Ella Neal. Now, what's interesting was Ella Neal was not elected to anything. She was not even appointed as an official member of government. She was appointed as Governor Cohn's secretary. And I don't mean like the secretary that's head of an executive department kind of secretary. I mean like go get the coffee and make my appointments, for this afternoon kind of secretary, right? Because when Fred Cohn was in office, Fred Cohn had a little heart problem, right? The blood that was going out started to go back in. And for those of you who don't know how the heart works, that's bad, right? And Cohn actually goes through this period for about a year and a half to 2 years where he's kind of incapacitated. And he could only meet with people on a day-to-day basis in a very limited kind of fashion. And in a lot of ways, Ella Neal was the virtual governor because she was the one that could determine of the couple of hours a day that Fred Cohn could work, who he was going to meet with, how he was going to determine his legislation that he was going to sign. And in some cases, they think that she may have even forged his signature on a number of official documents because Cohn was too sick to actually get a lot of this work done. The government workers in Tallahassee figured out pretty quickly who was actually in charge, and they started courting, Ella Neal to see if, hey, do you need me to do anything? Can you get me some FaceTime with the governor? And so in a lot of ways, she was kind of the governor herself. Now, when Cohn recovered his health and he figured out what was going on, he fired Miss Ella. So unfortunately, Ella Neal paid the price for her intervention, but in a lot of ways, she was Florida's first woman governor. Now, Florida did have 3 other women political figures of sort of large note, but unlike Ella Neal, they all won elections, okay? You had Ruth Owen, right, who was the first female representative for Florida in Congress. She was from Miami. And you had Edna Fuller, and she was elected from Orange County in the state House of Representatives. And then last but not least, Mamie Eaton Green of Monticello, right? So, hey, hometown girl, right? She wins the post of the state railroad supervisor, which was a bigger deal back then, obviously, than it is now. Also, another important statewide political figure that becomes a national political figure, really for the first time in Florida history, is Claude Pepper. Pepper was from Perry, so for those of you from Taylor County, right, this is your guy. And throughout the 1920s and the 1930s, Pepper had been a very loyal Democrat, and he'd been moving up through the Florida party ranks, and then eventually the National Democrat Party ranks. And if there really was never a large statewide candidate that could command everybody's attention, the one exception to that was Claude Pepper. Okay, Pepper, people in Florida knew who he was, and they generally liked who he was, and they thought that he was doing a pretty good job, and he's going to win a U.S. Senate seat in 1938. And Pepper was not just a leader in terms of, Florida politics knows who he is, and he really has a large influence on Florida's congressional delegation, for example, but he actually became a real leader in the Senate. He was very tightly interwoven with FDR and these New Deal policies that Roosevelt wanted to put into place. He was one of those loyal, leftist kind of New Deal guys that Roosevelt could count on not only to vote for his proposals, but also sort of rally up support amongst other Congress people in order to get things done, right? Now, what's interesting is this view is very popular in the 1930s, and this is during a time when FDR is pumping, millions of dollars into Florida. Pepper also became, if Pepper was perceived as sort of Florida's voice to the nation, in a lot of ways, the rest of the nation perceived that in the same way as well, right? Florida became sort of recognized as, well, this is where Claude Pepper's from. Claude Pepper is their sort of spokesman. And so for 14 years, he kind of becomes the public face of Florida. And he really did represent Florida's commitment to the New Deal in the 1930s. But what we're going to see is that Pepper's sort of liberalism, his very big government kind of ideology that had made him very popular in the 1930s, when big government was pretty popular, is going to make him sort of a social or political outcast by the time you get to 1950, when that sort of viewpoint is very much on the wane with this. There was a postage stamp, right, to give you an idea kind of how famous this guy was. A national postage stamp of Claude Pepper, who was a senator from Florida at this point. This is Claude Pepper in the 1930s giving a speech. Either that or he's maybe ordering a hot dog from the guy in the back. And this is a political cartoon that's not as kind to Claude Pepper. He's sort of the crimson-colored zombie that wants your money from an anti-Claude Pepper campaign in the 1950s, right? So got a little political stuff, not non-political stuff, right? We got a little cultural stuff here of these juke joints, right? Of this blues music of the 1930s in Florida, to give you an idea of a little bit of cultural flavor with this. This is Robert Johnson and the smooth sounds of the blues. Would be playing if we were doing this in class. But of course, it's not going to play over the little webcam thing. So anyway, if you get a chance, Google up Robert Johnson and Kind-Hearted Woman Blues. Listen to that for a couple of minutes, and then get some of the smooth sounds of the 1930s into your heads. And so that's it for the first part of the 1930s in Florida history, and we'll pick up with more a little bit later.